The title for today's talk is In Search of Justice in Coal Transition in India. And India, of course, is committed to having a low carbon economy, but the importance of coal in the country has increased over the last few decades and seems to be increasing. This reality begs the question, how can a just transition be achieved in India? What kind of justice do we want to achieve and for whom? And in today's presentation, Kuntala will argue that there is not one single coal economy in India, and any framework of just transition must take the multiplicities of coal economies into consideration. Okay, now let me just briefly introduce Kuntala. I'm sure most of our audience would know Kuntala and her work, but I think it is only proper that I introduce Kuntala in a more formal way. So Professor Kuntala Lahiri-Dutt is with the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University's College of Asia and the Pacific. Kuntala has over 30 years of experience studying the challenges of livelihoods in India. Her research deals with the social and ecological aspects of resources, both large and industrial, as well as informal, artisanal, and small-scale mines and quarries, water resource management, and feminization of agriculture in the country. Kuntala's publications in these areas have influenced younger generations of researchers, and her work has been useful to both international and grassroots-level development organizations. Currently, Kuntala is researching how global coal sector transition can be gender just, rather than ending to the economic, social, and political burdens on women in coal-reliant communities, especially in the global south. So I'll hand you over to Kuntala. We'll have, after Kuntala's presentation, we'll have chances for Q&A. So you can put your questions in Q&A, in the chat box, and we'll then, raise those questions with Kuntala, and hopefully we can take as many questions as possible today. So Kuntala, over to you.
Thank you, Pradeep. Thank you for that generous introduction. I will share my PowerPoint presentation, and if you see the title of my presentation, it kind of gives you an idea about the unfinished nature of my research, or I would say research journey on coal in India. And this journey started in mid and late 1990s when I was still based in India and researching the decay of peasantry and the rapid expansion of coal extraction in eastern India. I used to take a train from my hometown to the colliery tracks, and the train was named Black Diamond Express. So I mentioned this just to show how coal has been seen in post-colonial India. And on your screen, you can see the picture, the image of a black diamond, Thank you everyone for making time to be here today to listen to this webinar. I hope that all of you are going well and that you are safe. The topic of today is interesting because coal remains at the heart of India's development project. It is only rational that we should talk about justice at this critical juncture in India's history to ensure that the poor do not get left behind as the country considers moving away from coal. So this was the cover image of The Economist magazine on 5th December. And in a typical economist fashion, the issue asked us to look at Asia. Asia needs new policies to kick its coal habit, and soon, they said. It is true that coal consumption has rapidly grown in Asia, and 77% of all coal used in the world is now in Asia. So coal, you can say, is at the toxic heart of the fossil fuel economy globally. It is it's still 27% of the raw energy of everything globally. But Asia is a very particular case within that, and within that, India is a very particular case. Almost all countries in Asia, if you look at the coal extraction, it is state controlled. State plays a very important role, starting from mining companies to power stations to banks and the equipment making companies and so on. So the question that the economists threw us is important and relevant. And yeah, we want to make coal history in Asia as well. But the question is, will coal transition look the same in global South countries, or in Asia? So to understand what justice would look like in a country such as India, we need first to understand coal's role in India. So a recent report by the International Energy Agency, and many of you who are attending this seminar might have gone through that report. It's on India, notes that it was coal-fired electricity that allowed India to achieve two critical successes. First, what they describe as the monumental success of bringing electricity connections to millions of poor people around the country, and grasp the transformative potential of renewables, particularly solar energy. So these are the two monumental successes of India. But although India has realized the transformative potential of renewables, and it does talk about renewables, investing in renewables, particularly solar energy, coal's days are not over in India. Not yet. India remains the third largest producer and consumer of coal and the second largest coal market in the world. India is the third largest emitter of CO2 in the world. And this designation comes without even considering the various bunker emissions from biomass burning and so on. So although we must also say that although on a per capita basis, India's emission rate is only half of the global average. But think about India, even putting aside India's population size and expanding economy and so on, if only I focus on the need that every rural or poor household feels for one electric bulb per household to educate the children, that is the definition of being connected to the electricity grid in India. So I will not be entirely wrong if I say that much of India's future prosperity hinges upon coal. It is for valid reasons that India has attributed an iconic status to coal, as I had illustrated in my book, The Coal Nation, that was published in India, in which I described India as the coal nation. However, today, India is also at a crucial juncture of history when it can choose from a wide array of energy futures. So let us not forget the 270 million people who will leave the rural areas to come to the cities over the next 2 decades to live in the bustling cities. The shift away from biomass that will inevitably happen, the growing middle classes who will demand air conditioning or other electrical devices, the humongous construction projects that will be undertaken to house them, these people coming into the city in these mega cities or provide them with increased mobilities. And the surge in demand for steel and cement that will drive the construction industry. To put it in short, we are looking at a dynamic economy par excellence. So these are my arguments for the presentation today. So I have two interlinked arguments. And I say that a transition away from coal would need to consider different aspects of justice and the goal of transition. And to substantiate this argument, I refer to Timothy Mitchell's ideas as expressed in the book Carbon Democracy. And I suggest that we use this moment in India as an opportunity to reimagine energy politics for the post-carbon world. And the second argument is that there is not one coal economy in India, and any framework of just transition must take the multiplicities of coal economies into consideration. And this conceptualization is based on J.K. Gibson Graham's idea of diverse economies. So based on this diverse economies concept, I will substantiate my argument that by showing that there are 4 or 5 coal economies of India. One could expand, actually, there are more than 5 even, with, and each of them have varied degrees of legality and formalization. So I'll just very briefly, I'm not a political scientist, so I'll very briefly talk about because I have uttered the word carbon democracy, what kind of future we are looking at. So this is a little bit of digression from our main point. Democracy has two kinds of meaning. First, it can be about ways of making effective claims for a more just and egalitarian common world. Or, secondly, it can refer to a mode of governing populations that employs popular consent as a means of limiting claims for greater equality and justice by dividing up the common world. So democratic struggles are fought over the distribution of issues, whether a type of issue should be in the public domain or the private domain. This is the logic of distribution. For example, the level of wages paid by employees. Capitalist owners would say that wages should be a matter of private concern, but democratic view would say that it is a public concern rather than private. So this logic of distribution designated a large new field of government known as the economy, whose rules set limits to alternative political claims. And one thing I wanted to just mention is that no democratic procedure is replicable. It's not simply a set of procedures and political forms that can be reproduced in every successful instance of democratization. So when we think about carbon democracy in Indian context, we are not thinking about that applying the exact same model in Europe or even in Indonesia. So energy economy is an object of politics. This is what Mitchell showed in his book, that the advent of coal, when coal came into existence, think about that, the 18th century, 19th century, it gave rise to unforeseen kinds of mass politics in Europe and in America in the late 19th and even early 20th centuries. So in new workplaces, these workplaces did not exist before. Labor unions, political clubs, people, ordinary people, they forged a political consciousness with which they fought for more egalitarian and democratic collective lives. So one would say that coal was a material that not only built a new socio-technical world, but actually created new forms of political agency. And from here, Mitchell takes his ideas into oil and talks about how oil is quite different and lends itself to centralized governance. But that's not the topic of our discussion for today. The question that Mitchell's book throws up is that how about renewable energy? So we are at the, at the cusp of another change. Coal was replaced, or coal came and gave way to oil, and now we are going to move into renewable energy. What kind of democratic uh, future can we envisage with renewable energy? That is the question. And before I move on, these are the two theoretical planks in my presentation today. I just wanted to talk about diverse economy a little bit, and the quotes are here. You can read it, and I'll just briefly explain what J.K. Gibson Graham say. And they say they present a picture of an iceberg. And as you know, when we see the iceberg, only a tip of the iceberg can be seen, and much of it is underwater, cannot be seen. So they say, J.K. Gibson Graham say that the I should say she, actually, it's the one person. The economy is like that iceberg. There is a lot of things happening, underneath that we cannot see. And the financial exchange economy, the capitalist economy that we are seeing, it's only part of that iceberg, visible tip of the iceberg. So what is underneath the iceberg? They say there are lots of things like care work, the household, and diversity in forms of economic transactions, labor and enterprises, and informal sector. It is a little bit expansion of the idea of informal sector, if you can understand that. Informal sector, kind of lends itself to the binary view of formal and informal, and then we say that how they are overlapping. And so diverse economy takes it a little bit forward and says that it's not only all good stuff that's inside that iceberg. There are lots of stuff that's happening, but we need to rethink the economy from a post-capitalist perspective, and so I think that's, post-capitalist perspective, revealing diversity in existing economic practices, broadening our view of what is important and viable economic activity. So I will show you how this is true in context of coal in India. But before I do that, let's quickly have a look at what has been happening, in globally. I call it coal global. In German language, it's Kohl, Kohle, coal global. And it's a twist on that. I remember there was there was a huge coal mine, Wolverine, in Germany, which has coal shut down and which has become a museum. And they organized um, in all museums, they have these exhibitions, and they wanted me to be an expert on women in coal mines. And they had totally forgotten their own history of women, Frauleins and Fraus working in German coal mines. Anyway, so it's a reference to that. Actually, if you think about, um, the title reminds me of Germany, where this coal mining has been put in the museums, but that's not everywhere. That's not the case. If you look at what has been happening in the world, you would see that there has been a rapid increase in coal production since 2000. This was largely driven by China's economic growth, but also to a small extent by India's economic growth. So that is what gave rise to the China's massive growth and and the commodity boom, that started from roughly 2003 and went on for about 10 years until 2013. The two beneficiaries of this resource boom, commodity boom, were Indonesia and Australia, that started coal mining in a very large way and became the two major coal exporters in the global market. But globally, coal is on the decline, and it must too to save humanity from the effects of climate change. Uh, but there are places and countries that are coal reliant still. Why is coal reliance even relevant to us? Because at the macro scale, there is this concept, there is a theory called resource curse, which was presented by Auti and has been taken up by economists such as Sachs and Warner and these sorts of people who work for the World Bank primarily. They talk about the negative effects of a country that relies on natural resources on longer term economic growth. In looking at the social, there's Dutch disease associated, other sectors of the economy die, but looking at the social side, higher corruption levels, lower education outcomes, barriers to democracy, and so on, dictatorial, authoritarian rule, and a Berkeley professor even correlated higher, resource curves with higher gender equality, particularly with oil. So interestingly, all the resource curves research that we are seeing on this slide primarily are on oil rather than coal. So reliance on coal is not correlated with resource curves thesis. Has not been done by anyone so far. So coal, with a very able young PhD student from my school, Crawford School of Public Policy. His name is Dr. Donny Pasaribu. He might be amongst the participants here. We tried this exercise to identify what is the coal reliance situation in the world today. And what we did is we looked at three aspects: supply, demand, and external factors. So supply, coal production, which is employment and economic output, but also looking at how coal is being exported, how that country is relying on the revenues of coal export and coal consumption. So, and then different weights were given on these three factors. Supply, obviously, supply side was given more weightage, and demand side was given 30% weightage, whereas external factors were given even less weight, 20%. So this is the list of the countries that came out from this study. And you would see that Australia is the highest, most coal reliant country. And although India is, sort of seems to be very high up when you look at coal production and CO2 emission and coal, as India as the coal market, India is actually in the 9th place when you look at formal data. So that's the interesting thing, that this is all based on formal employment data, which is showing India as in a very low place, right? So let's now go into India and see what is the situation there. So the data that are given on this larger pie graph is sourced from the Ministry of Power. And as some of Government of India data are greatly confusing. I think with my non-scientific brain, the way I understand it is that in fuel in the energy mix, coal is 53%, right? But if you look at the electricity production, because International Energy Agency's 2021 report notes that 70% of electricity in India comes from coal. So, and not only that, even the new electricity policy has noted that India needs more coal mining in the coming decades. So, experts such as Rahul Tongia, who is the lead author of the book, The Future of Coal in India, says that although solar now contributes to less than 4% of electricity, and coal nearly 70%. By 2040, they will converge in the low 30s as India fully goes through the solar powered revolution, in his word. Interesting thing for you to note on the right hand side of this diagram of this slide is that who owns these companies. Central government and state governments have, together have a kind of a balance, slightly more, 53%, as against the private companies contributing 47% of installed power capacity. So looking at this slide, suffice it to say that India's current energy needs are largely met by three fuels: coal, oil, and biomass, making it up to 80%. And this has remained the same since 1990. So in fact, the biomass is missing from this because that's not part of the Ministry of Power's portfolio. Sorry, I forgot to mention that. So in India, you have a Ministry of Power, you have a Ministry of Non-Renewable Energy, and a Ministry of Coal. So this is from Ministry of Power's data, but biomass is important for most rural people. So if you look at coal alone, it has strengthened its role as the dominant energy source, and it holds the key to power generation as a fuel of choice of many heavy industries, such as iron and steel. So let's now, we can go into coal reliance in India at a macro scale. I'm still talking about macro scale, and I will come to the nitty-gritties in a minute. So just a transition globally is characterized by debates on winners and losers, who will win, who will gain from the new energy systems, and where and how. And we know that wind and solar do not come up in the same locations where coal was being extracted. So we are not going into that spatial question of justice at all here. So taking India as a typical country of global south, what we need to know is the entirety of the picture of how coal is extracted, by whom, how it is moved, etc., to make sure that no one is left behind as coal mines are shut. So in this slide, I will draw your attention to some of the recent findings on coal reliance in India to look beyond that 44% figure that was given by the Power Ministry. So let's first ask, how is coal moved? So coal is mined in a colliery. So from the pit head, coal is moved by trucks to a nearby coal depot, from where it is transported, again by trucks, to the nearby railway station. So although more than 65% of India's cargo is moved by trucks, the trucking industry is entirely in the informal sector. Truck driving is the profession of choice for most poor, illiterate, first generation migrants from rural areas. A guesstimate would put the size of the economy at nearly 11,000 million US dollars in 2020. And there are about 2,000 trucks per million people in India. And that means around 2 million registered trucks on Indian roads. Very, conservative estimate. These are, from data that is available. There are many trucks, plying on Indian roads that have no documentation. Forget about that. A conservative guesstimate would then be at least 1/4 of these trucks carry coal, because coal gives them more, brings more money. So each truck has at least 2 helpers, very, a conservative estimate, besides the main driver. So these 3 individuals have families, and if there are 4 members in these families, that gives us a ballpark figure of 1.5 million people relying just on trucking coal. This calculation does not consider relative advantage of transporting coal, say, over other raw materials, trip numbers each truck makes, and the incomes from distance covered, and so on. So it's just a ballpark figure. So now let's move to the railway station. The trucks bring the coal to railway stations for being moved by wagons that look like this, in the picture. So Indian Railways is the state-owned company that transports coal from extraction sites to power plants. And the existence of this largest employer in India largely relies on moving coal. So according to a study by Brookings Institution, coal provides nearly 50% of the incomes of Indian railways. So how Indian railways overcharge the transport of coal to subsidize its passenger traffic. So if coal transportation by Indian railways is reduced, not only will there be an economic impact, the economic impact will also indirectly be felt by the passengers whose fares would go up. So along this supply chain, there are hundreds and thousands of people and their livelihoods involved. There's another researcher who has been, looking at coal and just transition in recent years. His name is Dr. Pai, S. Pai. Pai estimated more indicators of coal reliance. So he, using the Right to Information Act, he's an ex-journalist, now a PhD, he secured very detailed data at district level in India. And he says that there are currently 600,000 pensioners in the formal coal mining sector. With more coal mine closure, this number will increase to 1 million very quickly. So think about the pension load that the government of India will also have to carry. Then Pai mentions the CSR spending by coal companies in the districts where they are operating, and the effects of dwindling CSR incomes would also be significant, he says. So there's this direct and indirect impacts of coal reliance, and imagine how people are relying on coal and shutting down the coal economy in India. So now let me go to the research that I have been doing. So the data that you are seeing here are from an old study when production in million tons is given, and I say that there is a national coal. Let me just explain these names to you. You can say this is the national coal. That means it's produced by Coal India Limited, which is a state-owned company. So because it's owned by the state, and there are lots of nationalism around the establishment of Coal India Limited, I call it national coal. But from 1992, after India's economy opened up, India also started to allow coal mining in the private sector. So these privately owned coal mines, I would say, I call them neoliberal coal. The neoliberal coal is being produced by privately owned coal mines. And then, because environmental impact and analysis is done. There was one EIA report written probably 20 years, 30 years ago by somebody, Terry Pro most likely, and that gets, sort of rehashed and everywhere. I mean, if you look at some of the EIA reports of Indian mines, you will cry because they're meaningless. They're not contextual, not detailed. There's extensive dispossession, and I have written with my young colleague uh, Patrick Oscarson how, because coal mine happens in a project by project basis, the dispossession is not, the cumulative impact of dispossession is not clearly visible, you know, and individual projects we see. But in coal mining tracks, if you travel, get off the highway, travel through the countryside, you will see agriculture has died. There's so much of pollution. People are sick. The economy is sick. People have nothing to do. And those very people, lower caste, poor, indigenous people who were dispossessed by coal mining, who were pushed out for a subsistence, they are now digging coal. In one of my articles, I have even said that I met an indigenous man. I had met him 20 years ago when I had just started to do research in that area. And he recognized me and said, Didi, how are you? And then I said, what do you do? He said that I collect coal. So formerly he collected forest produce and now he collects coal. So the idea of illegality does not exist, in his head, but we call it an illegal coal mine. And then there is also northeastern Meghalaya state, which is given a special status by Indian constitution, where people can decide the future, the fate of their resources, their forests, their minerals, and so on. So people mine, by taking permission from the district councils, but they are, according to other various mining related and coal related laws, individual districts cannot give permission, individuals cannot mine coal, coal in particular. It's a commanding heights philosophy, coal, oil. You cannot mine uranium in India. If you are an individual, you have to be a company. So I call it non-legal type of economy. But now let's look at how many people were employed. I'm giving you 2012 and 13, figure. Let's move on to more recent years, right? Now, let me explain first before I move on to the more. See, in national coal, which is in the formal sector, you would see that there are 450,000 people employed in 2012. But national coal informal, now what is that? That's because Coal India Limited outsource 50% of its work, maybe 60%. And it is outsourced to not big companies, but local businessmen, local entrepreneurs, and so on, who just take that contract of work, removing overburden, digging up a bit of coal mine or digging up coal or transporting coal and so on. So loading the coal and so on. So again, displaced people who are there without a livelihood, they usually work in this informal sector. They work on a daily wage basis, earning around rupees 100 to rupees 150 per day. Whereas Coal India Limited's formal employees earn a lot more money. Similarly, that's why I said 4 or 5. Similarly, one could say that neoliberal coal has an informal sector, but I did not do the study, so I do not know. And this is more recently, last year I updated this data through a bit more work, and I found that very interesting that there is two types of exigent coal. This did not exist before. Well, not to this extent, not to as such important presence, that imported coal, and this is something that we did not have so far. And what we did not have is the state public PSUs. Rajasthan government, for example, mines coal from Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, and it doesn't do it here itself. So with the state PSU, you could have an informal sector, very large informal sector, because all of its work is contracted out. So if you look at the different coal economies in India, labor involved today, this would be a rough picture, very broad, I would say. Now, don't ask me about the nitty-gritties. Why do you say captive 50,000? It is captive 60,000 or whatever. It could be 60,000 or it could be more. As I said, captive contractors. And I have just said 50,000. It could be more again. And so this is the reality of coal mining in India. So I have talked about direct and indirect impacts, and jobs and all that. But there is also something called induced jobs, jobs that are not in the value chain of coal extraction, but it is also part of the extended value chain in a way, or you can say they are the next layer of jobs, services, ancillary activities, and so on. So all this is included. And if you put want to see the whole picture of coal reliance, for livelihoods, you would need probably another 10 of these bubbles around each of them, and an unbelievable number of people whose livelihoods are directly involved in coal mining. So this is where I want to just step back and come to the main theoretical points and talk a little bit about just linking everything together. So we have talked about just transition. What kind of justice is it? The justice is not just the one thing. In India, as it like any other post-colonial country, Jean and John Komarov in their Law and Disorder in the post-colony book, they talk about how post-colonial countries are obsessed with laws. And India is no exception to that. We are obsessed by laws. We forget that morality, which belongs to a particular space and time, is behind that law. So justice is this big idea that we do not think, we think about justice only as the legal justice system, whereas we are in just transition basically talking about procedural justice and distributive justice. And remember that when we talk about social justice in a social context, when we talk about social justice, at the heart of social justice is redistribution of power. That is the important thing, redistribution of power. So just transition would lead to a redistribution of power. How will we make it possible? The redistribution would follow 5 key principles: access to resources, equity, diversity, participation, and human rights. So how do we want to see justice? And again, I'm not a legal expert, so I went to the legal philosopher, political philosopher, Professor Michael Sandel in Harvard, who's the author of the book Justice, and to understand how do we want to see justice in just transition. And he says it is basically the right way to do things. Fairness, it's just distinguishing right from wrong. It's the right way to distribute things. It's the right way to value things. So when Michael Sandel talks about justice, he actually puts a lot of importance on things like deliberation and discussion on what is right for individual people, and not coming to a consensus necessarily, because he puts more importance on the deliberation
on fairness. That deliberation is the important thing. And he also says that understanding our own privileges is important so that we can overcome the tyranny of merit. But that doesn't happen in India. Let me show you why. So before that, I just touch on four approaches to just transition. I mean, I'm sure as time will go past, there will be more approaches, but if you can think of a rainbow, on one end of that rainbow is status quo approach, which is associated with corporatists and free market genres of thought, greening of the economy for new business opportunities. This is happening all the time. The slightly more consultative is managerial reform, not really consultative, creating or modifying standards. It's still who has the agency? The corporations, the government, they have the agency. They're modifying standards and rules, and they're putting more focus on employment, health, education, but without compromising the existing socioeconomic model and power balances. So as you can imagine, in the last 2 years, I've been continuously listening to various stakeholders, meeting them and talking to them, and also listening to webinars and so on. And I was unfortunate enough to attend one of the meetings of European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, where it was an open meeting, and they were talking about just transition in Europe. And this kind of managerial reform or structural reform approach came through from this. What we need to do, we need to put more money here, we need to put more, money in leadership building, and usual, the words that you can expect to hear. But what is at the other end of the rainbow is the transformative approach. And it really agrees with me, because as a feminist, I also believe that, our transforming the existing system is our target, it's the ultimate objective. So transformative approach proposes alternative development pathways and radical changes in the relationship between the economy and the environment. How do they want to do that? They talk about things like rights of workers, they talk about racism, they talk about gender inequality, they talk about the north-south divide. And there are things like the new Green Deal in the USA, the Just Transition Alliance in Oregon, and the Labor Network for Sustainability, which is also in the USA, which are showing ways of being democratic, inclusive, and community-led. So let's now talk about privileges and what is the just transition debate in India. So luckily, the just transition, this debate has begun in India. So I was fortunate enough to attend quite a few of these webinars that were iForest quickly jumped in. iForest is led by Chandra Bhushan, who was in CSE, who split from Center for Science and Environment and created his own organization, iForest. And his young colleagues working with Chandra has gone and done a study which is published in 2020 as Bhushan et al. That sees just transition as both distributive and procedural justice for people in the mining areas, planning to ensure for sharing of, FOR, for sharing of costs and benefits amongst different groups of people, and all inclusive decision-making process and recognition of collective ownership. The thought process, as you can see, is still focused on large-scale mining and formal sector mining. So Terry is again very top-down, but still they are talking about, because young people are like Bhattacharya, who did that study, they are the field workers in Terry. They went and studied the situation, what is going on, and say they're suggesting that investments in rural development and also creation of new sustainable jobs through the promotion of rural agri-based enterprises are necessary. And Sandeep Pai, also talks about coal dependence. As I said, he showed how 33 districts in India are coal reliant or coal dependent in his words. And these are the 33 districts that need to be under microscopic scrutiny, and special attention should be given to these districts. Summing up the debate, I would say the debate is not only new, but it is also very top down. It is still looking at coal mining economy as this one economy, formal sector, so privately owned mine. It's looking at data, looking at published data sources. So it's very limited in its, and it's also very Delhi based. There have been also seminars held by Center for Policy Research and CUTS. CUTS is a more, I would say, consumer and trade union related NGO think tank based in Jaipur. So the CUTS' webinar was also quite, a little bit of different from the others. So I would say primarily Delhi based in this debate. So let's now come to the cream of our discussion. So what we are seeing, I said that this is a critical juncture in India's history. What we are seeing, energy transition is one shift. Three simultaneous shifts occur at the same time. And that's what Timothy Mitchell also says in his book, in Carbon Democracy. He says that when this shift from, new coal came into existence, new energy system. At the moment, it's not only new energy systems, but new mobility systems and new communication systems. Let us not forget the Internet of Things and artificial intelligence and all that things that are coming into existence. I mean, we are living in a very rapidly changing world. So if we think that we will, keep it just the same, market, it is true that market is pushing some of the renewable developments, but market, big companies like Australia's own Origin Energy is becoming the major player in the solar market in Australia. That's unfortunate, so that circle that you're seeing, market and financial flows and technology, feeding each other, it's not just transition, it's what Ashley Dawson calls green capitalism, really. So one, community investments, we will come to that in a minute, but there is no community investment envisaged in this diagram. So it's really green capitalism, what you're looking at. It is true that energy transition has been described as a transition towards electricity, and electricity has come to be over the years associated with all that is large scale, centralized systems, oil, gas, hydro, nuclear, and so on. And decentralized systems are coming up already in various places. I will, of course, give examples from the global north countries, windmills that are owned by communities in Denmark or Germany. In Germany, 50% of all RE is owned by cooperatives. Think of Canada. Wind turbines are owned by First Nations people in Western Ontario. In Alberta province, there's a town called Town of Banff. I do not know how to pronounce it, BNFF. And they have started their own community-based, city-based, town-based energy production system. So there are models available. And what is RE saying really to us? That it's owned by people. It is either owned by people, from these experiences in Europe and Canada and so on. It can be owned by SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises and local communities. It requires more space. Definitely, it's more space intensive than coal or gas. But there is literature that's coming up now. There's an article by Clack et al., which is a highly economic article, numbers, which says that decentralization makes economic sense. And not only that, there's this new movement in Europe called energy cities, because they see cities as this vibrant, buoyant thing. They have the capacity and the resource to realize projects. They're the strong political actors. They're at the frontiers of issues such as energy, poverty, local economic development, and climate action. So decentralization is happening as people are finding more ways to engage in community energy. Certainly in UK, even in USA. There's a project called Energy Democracy Project that is bringing justice, questions of justice and equity in clean energy. So this is my last slide, and I will end with that in India, we have a very poor record of, we do not know how to plan a mine closure. We just, almost all the mines that are closed, Coal India Limited call them as temporarily closed. So they're basically abandoned for the time being, until the coal price goes up and, and extraction of coal becomes economically feasible. We have a, history of dispossession. We have a country where the idea of human rights is diluted and where legitimacy remains a complex issue. So when we talk about justice in India, I would say that redistribution of power is not impossible, and community-owned renewable energy would be the way, and that is where iForest and TERI and think tanks like Center for Policy Research should invest, because this is our opportunity. We need to first understand the nature of the beast, and the nature of the beast is very different in individual countries like Asian countries like India, in the global South countries. And the strategies that have worked in European Union and North America might not work in these countries, and justice would be also the recognition of the diversity of coal economies and the diversity of people who are reliant on these coal economies. And that's when justice will be accomplished in India. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Kuntala. And I'm sure those of you who have been stimulated by this indeed very stimulating talk, if you have any questions, you can get in touch with Kuntala directly. I'm sure it's not too hard to find Kuntala's email address at ANU. And I just want to thank Kuntala for this really very wide-ranging and very stimulating presentation. Unfortunately, we do have to wind up here. So thank you, Kuntala, and thank you all for attending today, our second Fellows Seminar.
Thank you, and feel free to write to me, any of you, or on my staff page, my phone number is also given. So if you wanted to call me, that should also be just fine for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.